But I did make a promise now, didn't I? No use going back on my word. Clive pulled out his knife, a capable-looking weapon of dull steel and leather-bound hilt. He held it up and then sliced through the rope. When I was free, he grabbed me by the arm and pulled me to him. "No, please," I said, quavering, "let me go." Then he did something I didn't expect. He let me go. At the same time, he cried out and lunged forward, reaching out for the wagon. I saw an arrow sticking out of his shoulder as he caught himself on the wagon door. He whipped around to defend himself, and the arrow shaft in his back nearly hit me in the head. Cringing, I ducked beside the wagon wheel, searching for the shooters and wondering what new calamity had arrived. More arrows were flying now, and with them a dozen horses with riders came thundering into camp. One of those riders was Ben Redcliffe, and he was making a beeline for Oswald. Oswald dropped his coffee and took off running into the woods. Clutching his shoulder, Clive made to follow his boss. "Lisbette," George said. He was looking pointedly down at the ground beside me. There on the ground was Clive's knife. Never dreaming Clive would come back for it, I grabbed the knife and stood up just in time to see Clive lunging for me. I yelped and dove behind the prisoners, but as Clive followed suit, Richard reached over and grabbed the arrow in Clive's shoulder and yanked. Clive screamed and fell to his knees. I closed my eyes just as George swung his hands against the side of Clive's head. Clive fell to the ground, senseless. I took the knife and started to saw away at Richard's ropes. Clive must have taken good care of the knife, because it slid through the fibers like butter. The rope fell from Richard's hands, and I moved to cut the rope of the next man, but before I knew what was happening, Richard snapped the knife from my hand, grabbed my wrist, and started running. I skid my heels into the ground. "What are you doing?" I cried. "We have to free the others." His eyes went wide. "Free them? Why? So they can tie me up again?" "Then go on without me. I've got to let them go." He yanked on my arm and started running again. "Sorry, I can't let you do that." "Richard, stop it," I said, refusing to run. I fell to the ground, but he didn't let go. Instead, he stopped and picked me up by the waist and started carrying me. I kicked and clawed at him. We got about as far as the pine trees before he dropped me. He was bleeding from where I had scratched him in the face. "Just go," I said, "but I'm not going with you." He leaned down and shook me by the shoulders. "Tell me what you told Timothy this morning." I was silent. He shook me hard. "Tell me." My eyes were ringing, but I smiled bitterly at him. "What do you think I told him?" His fingers gripped my arm painfully. "You never threw the seal in the river, did you?" he said. "Where did you put it?" From out of the trees, 2 horses burst onto the scene. Richard dropped his hands and stood upright, ready to run. The riders, silhouetted against the fading light, charged toward us, eating up the loose soil and sending dead leaves flying. Behind. They reined in, and one pointed, saying, "There she is." It was Ben Redcliffe's voice. I looked at the other rider and realized it was Timothy. He dismounted and came close enough that I could see his satisfied smile. "I was hoping I'd find you both all right." "I am not all right," I said, getting to my feet. "Where have you been?" "I went to get help, obviously." Richard dusted himself off. "Well, next time, tell someone, won't you?" Timothy grinned. "I would have, but I didn't get the chance. As soon as the guard turned his back, I knew I had only a minute to disappear. I took off running for Redcliffe's camp. I'll tell you all about it, but first let's find something to eat. I'm starving." "I'm not going anywhere until you tell your friend here to back off," I said, looking meaningfully at Richard. Timothy's grin disappeared. "Why? What happened?" "What happened?" Richard said. "I was trying to save her life, and she fought me every step of the way. Look at my face." "I was trying to help free the others," I said, "but he started dragging me into the forest. And when I say dragging," I was interrupted by the sound of Redcliffe's laughter. I gaped at him. "What's so funny?" His eyes were crinkled tight with amusement. "I would have liked to have seen anyone try to drag Miss Lisbette Blackwood somewhere she didn't want to go." A glimmer of a smile returned to Timothy's face. I shoved my hair from out of my face and put my hands on my hips. "I have been sorely abused." "Come, Mr. Easton," Redcliffe said, walking back to his horse. "The soldiers are my prisoners now, but if the abused Miss Blackwood wants me to, I'll set them free. In the meantime, we can at least help ourselves to the spoils. They say Oswald never travels without a good side of pork." Redcliffe fed us all that night with the goods found in Oswald's camp. As for Oswald and his men, they were nowhere to be seen. Redcliffe was vague about the details, but said something to the effect that once a robber crosses the wrong side of the road, as Oswald had, the sheriff turns his head from the consequences. "I will say this," Redcliffe said from his camp chair before the fire, a mug in his hand. Whatever it was he was drinking, no one had offered me a glass. "Oswald won't be crossing the road again, not on his own feet anyway. And now," he said to George. He was speaking louder than was necessary, but he didn't seem to notice. "You, Captain, and your men are free to go, on orders from Miss Blackwood." "You're letting us go?" George asked, putting down his cup. What do I want with you? Redcliffe asked, mushing his syllables together. He tipped his mug back and finished the last few drops. Just finish with your business and get out of my hills, you hear me? George stood up. I have your word that you won't try to stop us? Redcliffe shook his head. Why would I? I already have your gold. This brought on a roar of laughter from the other robbers. George, however, did not think this was funny. And our weapons, will you give us those back? Redcliffe stopped laughing with the rest. Weapons? What do you need with those? You'll go back to the west and have them replaced in a day. Me, on the other hand, when will I find a bow as fine as this one again? He held up the said weapon in his hand. Timothy and Richard had drawn themselves apart from the group and were talking quietly with each other, but Timothy stopped what he was saying and spoke up to Redcliffe. Give them something to hunt food with and to protect themselves from the bears. You can't deny them that. Rubbing his chin, Redcliffe considered. Very well. As a gesture of goodwill, I bequeath you with a bow and arrows. Now, don't forget to tell the new king how good I was to you when you go back to Ottleton. I wouldn't want him to think we were criminals or anything. Redcliffe stood up and put his arm heavily over George's shoulder. Now, he said, I know you Westies get lost easy, so listen carefully. Just keep the wind to your left ear, and you'll eventually find the road again. George jerked his head at Timothy and Richard. And what about them? He asked Redcliffe. Will you let me take my prisoners too? Redcliffe leaned even heavier on George, tickled with amusement. Oh, it's like that, is it? I give you a bow and arrows, and you think you have prisoners again. No, your prisoners are now my prisoners. To keep for ransom, I suppose. Not that it's any of your business, but no, I'm letting them go as soon as they feel like it. Not that I like the dark-haired fellow very much. Him I'd sell for a crate of chickens. But he's Timothy Easton's friend, and Timothy Easton is now my friend. And since his friends are my friends, we're all friends, see? George's eye fell on me. Lisbette, what about you? Will you come with us? I sat up, surprised. Me? Well, that depends. How fast can you take me to Easton? That depends on where Richard and Timothy are going. If that's where they're heading, then that's where I'm going. My job isn't done until I bring them back to be tried for their crimes. I thought about that for a moment. Finally, I shook my head. It's going to take you too long to find horses and supplies. I'm late as it is. But I can hardly leave you here with robbers. Redcliffe thumped George on the back. Charles Blackwood was a true gentleman. I would disgrace myself and my family if I didn't see that his daughter was returned home in safety. Thank you, Ben, I said. George didn't seem pleased with my answer, but he was being pushed away from the fire and urged on his way. We watched as he and his men disappeared in the darkness, heading north toward the road until they disappeared from sight. Then I turned to Redcliffe. Will you really help me home? Of course, he said, falling back into his seat. Where's my cup? Oh, here it is. When do we leave? Whenever Mr. Easton is ready. Oh, I said, eyeing Timothy, he's coming with us? That seems to be his plan. Do you have any objections? Timothy asked me. I just thought you might want to stay and look around some more, do some more treasure hunting. But if you've really given that up, then I can hardly complain. Maybe there's still hope for you. Oh, I haven't quit looking for treasure, Timothy said, looking at me steadily from across the fire. But I have a very good feeling I might find what I'm looking for soon. Tonight, if I'm lucky. I folded my arms and looked away. Seems a silly thing to do if you ask me. But if that's what you have to do, I suppose I can't stop you. Still, if you aren't ready to travel by first light, I'm going without you. I don't care if I have to go alone and on foot. I'm going to get home by Wednesday, Thursday by the latest, if it kills me. I glanced back to gauge his reaction, but he was staring coolly back at me, not even a little bothered by my threats of taking off on my own. It was feeling very late before people started to go to bed. I had announced that I would be sleeping by the fire so that no one would get any ideas about putting up a tent for me. Not that I had anything to worry about. Ben and his robbers showed no signs of spontaneous altruism as they busied themselves building their own half-hearted shelters.